Good morning. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 4, which is entitled Benjamin Franklin's America. And Franklin is a critically important figure for us to consider in terms of our study of American history, specifically in this period of American history. Now, that probably goes without saying. I doubt there's anyone in the audience out there that is unaware of Franklin's significance. But the reason we're stressing Franklin, and the reason the book stresses Franklin, is that he is referred to oftentimes by historians as the first American. And that is an important distinction, an important title for him, because if we come to understand the way that he looked at his world, we begin to get a sense of how the Americans began to conceive of themselves as different from being British. And this would be something that would take place over the course of Franklin's career, over his lifetime. And it also serves to kind of be a guide as to where the country is headed. So, just by way of a reprise of the chapters that we have covered, in Chapter 1 we dealt with the Columbian Exchange. In Chapter 2 we dealt with many things, but one of the things that was stressed was the very different colonies that were established in the South and in the North by the English, contrasting Jamestown, say, with the experience of the Puritans in New England. Chapter 3 dealt with all the imperial contest for power in North America, particularly with the Spanish, the French, the English, the Dutch, and even the Iroquois, which represented a Native American empire of sorts, if you want to use that word. This chapter is going to deal with primarily the English experience in America and how the English came to identify themselves as a very meaningful part of the British Empire, what would become the British Empire by the time of the 18th century. And yet, as we see the colonies trying desperately to be British, we begin to pick up on something that we see even in the life of Benjamin Franklin, which is they're becoming something different. They're becoming Americans. And before the Revolution kind of codifies this, before there is anything as formal as a Declaration of Independence, it's important to note that over the course of the 18th century, the English colonists began to become something entirely different than their British counterparts across the sea. Entirely different in terms of how they viewed themselves and their own kind of independent ways of thinking. Not necessarily culturally different, not necessarily socially different, but definitely politically different and economically different. And these will be very, very important foundations for the way that the United States will conceive of itself as we move forward in our study of history. Now, the book is very extensive in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 touches on a lot of things, and so we're going to make our way through the chapter by being fairly selective about what to emphasize and stress. And the thing that we want to really begin with is the fact that the English colonies had a set of strengths that neither the French or the Spanish could match, and that had primarily to do with the explosive population growth that occurred in the English colonies. Remember that the Spanish kind of confined themselves to Central and South America and were interested primarily in extracting that wealth, and so they never quite created the settlements that would be on the order of what the English would do in North America. And then, of course, you have the French, who are, their presence was very well known in North America, but they had the experience of dealing with Native Americans on the interior of the continent. If we think about Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, and what this meant was that they were, more or less interested in trading with the natives, maintaining good relations, and so there was never a real attempt to populate New France as much as would be the case in the English colonies. Another thing to keep in mind is that France was interested in keeping New France Catholic and royal, and that meant that troublemakers in France were not allowed to emigrate to the New World, and that certainly slowed population growth. Contrast that again with the English, who, of course, if they had any trouble in England with folks, the New World was one of the easiest ways to deal with it, to get rid of them. So the population growth in the English colonies is really something to note, and it's very important to realize too that the English colonies will kind of always have this youthful sense, this youthful spirit, and it's no wonder that they would take advantage of some of the new technologies that were on offer. The book mentions, to begin with, keeping Franklin in mind, the rise of the newspaper industry and just how important newspapers were in early America. Of course, the English colonies also developed ways in which they could be largely self-sufficient, although Franklin early on didn't think that there would ever be any competition with what the British manufactured, that instead that the English colonies would simply complement what the British were doing. This will change, of course, after the French and Indian War, when the British are very concerned about manufacturers inside the colonies. They're very concerned about who the colonies trade with, other nations and empires, and will really try and control that more than they ever did through a policy known as mercantilism. But generally speaking, because of the population growth, Franklin was aware that there was a real possibility that the Americas could outstrip England in terms of the amount of people living there, that they could become the most populous part of the British Empire, and this was a rather exciting prospect for Franklin. One of the ways to explain this is there was an extraordinarily high birth rate that was occurring in the Americas. And if you think about, despite some of the early difficulties, both with geography and with Native Americans, once those were overcome, there was a pretty readily supply of land that the English colonies could take advantage of, and it allowed for the population growth to increase naturally. There was, of course, a lot of nutritional gain in the Americas too, because of this land issue, and it is no wonder that so many immigrants would find their way into the colonies. A lot of criminals came too, as we've discussed previously, and even though the French wouldn't allow the Huguenots, or the Protestants, to leave France for New France, many Huguenots would find themselves coming to the Americas. So too would Jews, who had always been on the margins of European society. Scottish immigrants would find their way into the Americas too, and many Irish Catholics would come to America, and there will be a very unique blending of those cultures in what is known as the Scotch-Irish, kind of the quintessential frontiersmen, as the book puts it. Germans, of course, also arrived and were a very diverse group, and of course some of the most famous German settlers would have been in Franklin's Pennsylvania, known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, which was basically just a play on the word Deutsch, which of course is German for what we would call German. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are a great example of that. And of course they would come up with the covered wagon, which, what could be more American than that? So just as we noted previously in another chapter, the Swedes will come up with the log cabin, that is so tied to America and our American identity. The, uh, the Pennsylvania Dutch will come up with the covered wagon. Of course, not all of the population increase was due to uh, the natural increase in births of free men and women or immigrants pouring into the country. Um, a lot of the population increase would have to do with the scourge of slavery. An institution that became hardwired into American society, certainly by the time of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which was discussed previously in another chapter. As one of the great uh, historians put it, Ira Berlin, and the book quotes him here, says uh, the Americans or the American colonies, the English colonies, became societies with slaves. They went from that to becoming slave societies, and that really says it all. Um, and that will happen by the time we get into the 18th century. It is also the case that if we go back to the 17th century for a moment, um, the idea that slaves were a completely different kind of people, that if you happen to be of African descent or Caribbean descent, that you were somehow a totally different person in America, that idea still had not taken hold in the 17th century. There were even cases where slaves could be made free, and that was not all that uncommon. But of course, as slavery became hardwired, as we became slave societies, they would increasingly become a people apart, which means that we would begin to see all kinds of laws, not just in the South, that would kind of codify the idea that you were a slave for uh, life and that all of your descendants would be slaves for life. So this became firmly entrenched with some new laws that were developed as we move from the 17th into the 18th century. And what this does to our understanding of slavery is that it shows that slavery was not something that had to be hardwired into American society. It was not something that was destined to become part of American society. Um, it represents the history of slavery, a series of choices, choices that may have had to do with the need for labor in the New World, but choices nonetheless, which means that it is possible to consider a counterfactual scenario where America became less dependent on slaves. Um, and it's unfortunate that that counterfactual scenario doesn't represent the real history. What does represent the real history is that slavery became entrenched, particularly in the South. And even though slaves were operating under terrible oppression, they were able to create separate identities that allowed for them to kind of network and form community with one another. It's truly a tragic situation, but you had great bonding take place within slave societies as a way of kind of mutually supporting each other as they underwent this terrible oppression. In like fashion, you had folks that we would now consider quote unquote white banding together and kind of setting themselves apart from these slave societies. What I mean by that is, if you'll recall Bacon's Rebellion, this was a case where you had former indentured servants, uh, white people, um, go to war against aristocratic white people. And so there was this class conflict that existed in a place like Virginia. All this melts away, and we begin to see, unfortunately, the development of a familiar narrative in places like Virginia and other areas of the South in which there is this incredible white-black divide. And let us not forget that this does not confine itself to the South. It also extends itself to the North. So, as the book rightly points out, divisions in Virginia became more of race than of class. And of course, that has an enormous amount of historical significance. Keep in mind that not all slave societies were based around plantation agriculture. So when we talk about rice and indigo, some of the crops that were cultivated in places like the Carolinas, there were actually different forms of slavery. We are very used to the kind of typical image of a plantation slave, but slaves who worked with rice and indigo actually worked in many cases in what we would refer to as the task system, which is almost a little bit closer to what we might see as resembling the sharecropping system after the Civil War once slavery is over. Now, they were still slaves, and there was no question about that. However, there was a certain degree of autonomy that was allowed to develop in some of these uh, task system oriented uh, operations. There was also an incredible amount of slave resistance, and it's important to realize that slaves never accepted their fate as slaves, but constantly worked to try and resist some of the uh, uh, conditions that they were under. This included, of course, folks that would run away and sometimes form maroon societies or communities, which were basically uh, societies that operated on the frontier of the colonies and were independent kind of former slave-run societies. And it's quite interesting to think about these maroon societies as just one form of resistance against the overall institution of slavery. Of course, even in the North, you had new laws developed, just like in the South, to really separate folks black and white. And it's really quite chilling to read this part of the chapter and realize that these things were not set in stone from the beginning of America, that they took time to evolve. So there were a series of deliberate steps and choices that were taken by people at the time to create this black-white divide, to create this divide between uh, the slaves and other Americans. And it's truly tragic. From our perspective, it's really quite shocking to realize that there was such little opposition to slavery at this time, that slavery was just readily accepted in American society. Most folks considered that there was this hierarchy of human beings, and that slaves simply occupied a particular position and status within that hierarchy. And it is unfortunate that later on, when the language of liberty is developed in America, that it is only belatedly applied to the slaves and to their human rights. Of course, if we pull back from just the concentration on slavery here, we can think about some of the other developments that were occurring. And the book mentions really kind of the last major colony that is developed, Georgia, which was supposed to be a very well planned colony in which it was going to reflect a lot of Enlightenment thinking. But despite all the enlightened thinking and the idea that maybe it would be a colony that wasn't tied to slavery, the book says Georgia became a slave society almost overnight. There was, it seemed, no other way the colony could prosper. So, again, one has to consider, was the rise of slavery in slave societies inevitable? Um, I think, offers too many excuses for some of the deliberate choices that were made. But it is important to keep in mind some of the unique conditions in America and perhaps to explain some of why slavery became so dominant there. If we think about, you know, the upper echelons of American society, we can think about two broad kind of classes: planters in the South and merchants in the North. Um, but it's important to realize that what we normally think of as an aristocratic society was really not the case in America, that there was this kind of broad-based middle class that seemed to develop, and we can probably attribute this to a lot of land ownership by fairly ordinary people. Remember, this was something that was not possible in England, but was possible because of geography and other aspects in the Americas, in the English colonies. Of course, the colonists would try and develop their houses, what they would call mansions. We probably wouldn't look at them as mansions today, but they were nice houses for many colonists back then, despite the fact that in some cases um, they were kind of glorified log cabins, or even if they had kind of masonry, sometimes there were still dirt floors, that sort of thing. But eventually, a certain style, a colonial style, took hold, and there was an attempt to kind of replicate, high fashion in Britain, to replicate that in America. And so gardens became a very important part of what you would see in a colonial house. And of course, furnishings, oftentimes, which would come from Great Britain. Silverware was a very important mark of distinction. If you had silverware, you were considered to be someone that had kind of made it and was of high rank in colonial society. Goods that seem commonplace to us were also ways of distinguishing yourself as refined: sugar, tobacco, tea. Those were all very important things. And as a result of this kind of refinement, there began to be kind of a different sense of what the American family was. And privacy became a, uh, a new kind of concern. I mean, obviously, you started to kind of cultivate a little bit of an inward life as people began to embellish their houses. There was, quite a bit of entertaining and all the rest, but definitely the idea of America being this place where you could start a family, and oftentimes a fairly big family, um, led to some rather romantic notions. Now, we normally associate the rise of Romanticism with the late uh, 18th and early 19th centuries, but in America it may have gotten a little bit of a boost because we see marriages that are formed primarily along the lines of affection rather than being arranged, and people taking a certain amount of pride in their children. And of course, entertaining became a big thing. The idea of visiting different houses and kind of showing off your family a little bit became a big part of kind of the American way of life. Another big part of American way of life, which will also kind of double down on the independence idea, is that there will be a certain amount of manufacturers that will be developed in America. Artisans will develop shops, and sometimes these will be outside of the home, sometimes they'll be within the home. But here we see, some element of finished products that the Americans will develop on their own. In some cases, things like furniture and silverware, and some of these items will be developed. It's important to note that you will actually have people like Paul Revere, who will be a silversmith, and very proud of his creations. There's several famous paintings in which he's kind of shown with some of his wares. The point ultimately, though, is that if you wanted the best stuff, it still came from Britain. And just about every American knew this, and they were kind of proud of the fact that they had, some of the finest British things. So again, there was a lot of crossover and a lot of attachment. Cities, of course, that developed and boomed are still recognizable today. New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Newport, Boston. There were lots of small towns, but these other cities were some pretty busy ports in many cases, and busy in what we call the Atlantic trade, which eventually the British will seek to control. Of course, you had a lot of those newspapers we mentioned earlier, books being printed, and by and large, the cities began to look a little less ramshackle and a little bit more ordered and refined, and that's a big point in this book. The English colonies began to really develop themselves along the lines of British civilization, and we're quite proud of kind of showing that off. Another very important thing that would show that you were a refined civilization, which the colonists were eager to do, was to show that America was into science. In this book, Inventing America is very much into this idea of the developments of science and technology and how that helps to explain the invention of America. And this is true very early on in the colonies. The idea that uh, there would be this contribution that Americans could make to science, particularly when it came to the botanical sciences. This was very important. Um, the idea that Franklin had, Benjamin Franklin, was to get America kind of attached to the Royal Society in Europe, which was very distinguished. And of course, there were things that American science contributed at this time. Inoculation was a very important thing. The book says that according to one authority, it was the chief American contribution to medicine prior to the 19th century. Um, Astronomy became an important area in which America became involved. But of course, it is Franklin, and really this chapter is all about Franklin in many ways. He's going to kind of stand for American science and the American Enlightenment. He's kind of like the Enlightenment figure, becomes world renowned. So I'll just quote a few things from the book. Franklin's achievement was outstanding by any measure. His contributions to the basic understanding of electricity were of such significance that contemporaries compared him with Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, Ben Franklin on the same plane. Truly incredible, especially when you consider the humble beginnings of Franklin in a place like Philadelphia. Franklin, of course, was known for lightning rods, bifocals, the Pennsylvania stove rather, the harmonica, which was a musical instrument, demographic theory. We talked about Ben Franklin talking a lot about the population increase, and even kind of the discovery of what has now become known as the Gulf Stream and how that changes meteorology. Franklin, of course, was also absolutely crucial in developing what is still known as the American Philosophical Society, also known as the society that would promote useful knowledge. And of course, that was really the hallmark of the era. The Enlightenment was all about taking the scientific revolution and applying it to everyday life, whether it be in the way that we constructed things for our material comfort, or whether it be in the way that we organize societies and governments. So you start to see a lot of things come together here in Franklin's life and Franklin's mind, and he kind of represents kind of the best and the brightest of the American experience. It's interesting because we just mentioned politics, and we know that eventually America will be very distinguished for developing original political forms. Um, this didn't quite exist so much in the colonial period. I mean, most of what the colonies did was replicate some of the political principles and ideas in England. But because there were so many people involved in the political process in the English colonies, because there was so much democracy, so to speak, it is noteworthy. In fact, it's kind of earth-shattering stuff when you take the view that we do from the perspective of 2013. The idea is that here you have, you know, the colonies kind of developing unique political forms, very much carrying on British traditions, but kind of tweaking them and changing them in interesting ways. There were royal governors that were eventually established in just about all the colonies, but those governors, of course, had to depend on colonial legislatures for their salaries, and that gave the legislatures a lot of power. And sometimes there would be these incredible fights that would take place between the governors and the assemblies, these legislatures in the New World, in the English colonies. And this was seen by the Americans as just the great English kind of revolutionary political tradition. Eventually, this is not going to be seen as so positive by the British themselves. Um, but by and large, the colonists, one of the greatest argument they make, even as we segue into the American experience, is that they are simply, you know, playing by the English book of rules when it comes to politics and democracy. And so it's very interesting to see this tension develop, in which you have the colonists believe that they're being super British, and the British, of course, 3,000 miles away, starting to cast a real skeptical eye on some of the rabble rousing that these legislatures and even some of these courts that the Americas had. Of course, you also had a little bit of a rebellion against authority with what is known as the Great Awakening. This was this religious event in which, generally speaking, you had these new lights in the Protestant tradition that were pushing back against the quote unquote old lights. We saw this in Puritan New England with the development of the halfway covenant. But of course, it really takes fire when we talked about kind of the burned over district and great preachers like George Whitefield, who will essentially create this new evangelical tradition in America. And a lot of colleges will be founded as a result of this. Brown, Princeton, Dartmouth, Rutgers, University of Pennsylvania, these were all kind of byproducts of the Great Awakening and this kind of new spirit of these new lights. And basically the idea was that, you know, people could have more control over their own individual salvation and their own individual religious beliefs. The Great Awakening, very powerful. It also suggests that the colonists will not be looking to religious authorities, possibly even political authorities, when it comes to determining their fate, their existence. So this is revolutionary stuff. The Great Awakening, sometimes referred to as one of the first causes of the American Revolution, and I would argue that that's pretty sound. That's reflected in a lot of history written in a lot of very fine books. Now, the last thing that we're looking at with the chapter here is an extremely significant event, something that we could spend a considerable amount of time on, and that is, of course, the wars against the French. Eventually, there will be, you might say, 4 French and Indian wars. We can talk about King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, also known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, because somebody got their ear cut off in the Caribbean. It is some fascinating stuff, these wars with France. But of course, when we typically say the French and Indian War, we're talking about a war that began in 1754. Primarily, this war is noteworthy because it starts in America. It starts over this disputed land claim in what was known as the Ohio River Valley. And this is where we're going to see a young George Washington, Virginian, make an appearance. George Washington's lifelong ambition was to be a British military officer, perhaps to advance to the rank of general and to be one of the great British generals. And George Washington was keen on this because he realized the military was one way that he could advance in the world and have everything that he ever wanted. He wanted to kind of become kind of a landed, maybe not aristocrat, I guess that's probably somewhat inaccurate, but definitely a very powerful person who would be a respected landlord and member of the community. Um, Washington, of course, um, was infamously not the first son of his family, which meant that he, according to the laws of primogeniture, um, he was not allowed to inherit his father's land. Therefore, he had to kind of make his own way in the world, and the military was a great way to do it. Well, Washington gets wrapped up with General Braddock, a, uh, uh, a British general, in the Ohio River Valley, and they go to basically defend the Ohio River Valley against the French. They go to what will eventually become uh, Pittsburgh and Fort Duquesne, and they try and hold that position against the French, and the French overrun it, and this, of course, helps to cause what becomes known as the French and Indian War. Uh, Ultimately, you have um, a situation where the French are making a very, very concerted effort to dominate, uh, North America. And the French always had the Indian allies. It's the reason why we call it the French and Indian War. The British had some Indian allies as well, but generally speaking, the French were very effective at border raids on English colonial settlements, and the French appeared to be winning very successfully in the war uh, against Britain. This, of course, changed when we had William Pitt, um, uh, William Pitt, who will become known as the Elder. He's going to be the guy that eventually will become prime minister and will change Britain's war strategy uh, to one that will confront the French in French Canada. And of course, General Wolfe, there's a great picture on page 135. Uh, General James Wolfe will win the Battle of Quebec in September 1759. And of course, that's kind of the turning point. Later on, they'll knock out Montreal. And of course, after that, the British will be well on their way to winning the French and Indian War. And this will be a great moment for everyone in the British Empire. The English colonists served alongside the French, or the British rather, against the French, and they were big participants in this war. And so when the war was won, there was this feeling that finally the great enemy of Britain had been vanquished, the French. They'll be out of North America entirely. And the colonists really believe that this opens up the West. This allows them to just continue to spread their colonies to the West and create opportunity just as they had done previously. The British will have a different way of looking at this, especially when they begin to look at the bills that this war helped to accumulate. The debt will be pretty staggering to the British, and they will begin to really wonder whether the colonies have pitched in as much as they need to maintain good order in the British Empire. They'll also be a little worried about just, the growth of the colonies. They'll seek to kind of control that and manipulate that so that it serves the interests of the mother country, England. This is all going to be, really nasty stuff in the next chapter, because essentially you're going to have, the English colonists realizing that victory in the French and Indian War meant something totally different to the English 3,000 miles that way. And that's going to create quite a rift, which will eventually play out in the American Revolution. Nonetheless, it's important to remember the pride that the Americans had as late as 1763 in being British. Um, that was the ambition of Franklin, to be this great British Enlightenment figure. That was the ambition of George Washington, to be this great British general. Um, remember that even when it came to some of the political conflicts in the English colonies, the idea is that the English colonists really thought they were being very British in resisting some of the authority of the governors and all the rest, trying to have some control over their politics and their local governance and the courts. So there's this incredible disconnect that is important to stress here at the end of the chapter. That the colonists really thought they were perhaps the best examples of British, of what it is to be British. And they'll be shocked, I mean, quite literally shocked and dismayed by the fact that the British across the sea don't necessarily share that opinion of the colonists, that they're actually quite upset that the colonists behave the way they do. And perhaps we could have sensed this a little bit in the French and Indian War. Couple perceptions that the soldiers, the English colonists fought with the British soldiers in the French and Indian War. And a couple things to really note are, from the colonist perspective, they were shocked at how cruel British discipline could be in terms of the soldiers. I mean, just really, really brutal stuff. If a soldier didn't do what he was expected to do, I mean, he could be flogged and essentially tortured by the British commanders. And this was shocking to the colonists, who had a little bit more of a democratic approach to their militias. And then, of course, the British, I mean, their opinion was, particularly of the New Englanders, was that they were just bad soldiers, that they just weren't disciplined. They didn't really know how to fight. They hadn't mastered anything. They were kind of just these rough characters from the frontier. And ultimately, the British commanders were extremely disdainful of the colonial contribution in the French and Indian War. This is not good, because this is going to sow the seeds of resentment, especially when you consider a guy like Washington, who really wanted to make it in British eyes. He wanted to be recognized as being truly British. He's going to get burned real bad, because there is going to be a lot of love lost between the two. And just to double back to the Great Awakening, which I previously stated is recognized by a lot of historians as one of the first major causes of the Revolutionary War, I would just have you consider this. The English colonists were a fairly religious bunch, and the Great Awakening made them even more so in many cases. Now, that wasn't a uniform rule, but not everyone was extremely religious. Washington might be an example of someone who was a little bit less than religious when compared to other colonists. But the idea is that the colonists believed that they were right, and not just right politically, as we'll see later on, economically, but that they were right morally. Go back to thinking about the Puritans and the way that they said they would create a model society. This idea that America has the right way to live is a very deep, deep tradition. And it goes all the way back to this time in the colonies, and perhaps even the Great Awakening. So when the American colonists got a chance to deal with the British soldiers, they really found them, as the book says, to be sinful, that there was something terribly corrupt and vile about them, and that this only fueled the idea that maybe the colonists were the true British, that they were the ones who really understood British political liberty, that they were the ones who understood what it meant to be independent from an economic point of view. They were the ones who understood what it meant to be morally correct and above board as far as ethics was concerned. They were, in their own eyes, super British. And of course, this is going to be in stark contrast to how the British really perceived the colonists. And of course, we'll see that rift develop tenfold in the next chapter once we move away from the French and Indian War. All right, Thank you. Have a good day.